and welcome to the Why Does He Do That webinar. I'm really looking forward to sharing with you over the next few hours what my key understandings are about abusive men and how they operate, why they operate the way they do, and how we can best help people free themselves from the control and domination of abusive men. And you may be watching this webinar for yourself because of what's going on in your own life, or you may be watching it primarily to help other people, whether that's through your job or loved ones in your life. We'll be talking about the inside of an abuser's mind. We'll be talking about some of the other factors that aren't really causes of abuse, but that can be part of what's going on with him, that can affect how he's behaving, and that can affect decisions that other people have to make in how to help him or not help him, and above all, how to help the woman get free. And those are issues such as, is he drinking or drugging, and how are those playing in? Does he maybe have some kind of mental health problems, and how are those playing in? Is he being totally backed up by everybody around him, so he thinks that just there's nothing wrong with him because everyone's on his team? Some of those kinds of issues of the surrounding contributing factors. We'll talk very briefly about what abusive men are like as parents. That's sort of an entire additional topic for another webinar. But in this program, we're going to just introduce a few basic concepts about what it's like for children to grow up with an abusive man in the house. And even if he's fairly good to them, there's a lot of issues that tend to go on for the kids in the house. And we'll talk about whether abusers can change or not, and if so, what does that look like? How do they change when they change? And how do you know? Because that's a question that people are often asking me. Women and people who are trying to help women in abusive relationships, he says he's going to change, or he's making these promises. Like, how do I know if any of this is going anywhere? And then I'm going to have a whole set of messages to women who are involved with a destructive man, and to, again, professionals, friends, relatives who are trying to help them, about just some key things that I'd like you to have in mind about what does this all mean for the woman who's involved with this guy. When I describe to you all these things about what he's like and how he operates, what are the kinds of effects that that's going to have on her, and what does that mean about what kind of steps are involved in helping her get to freedom? Let me start by telling you a little bit about how I come to be giving you this webinar. I was a counselor for about 15 years for men who abuse women. And over that period, I worked with over 1,000 abusive men directly. They were my own clients in groups. And then as a clinical supervisor, I supervised about another 1,000 cases. So I'm talking to you from a tremendous number of direct cases that I've been involved with. And I've worked with abusive men from all walks of life. I've worked with guys who never got past second grade to guys who had their PhDs. I've worked with guys who are incredibly successful, popular, good-looking, super well thought of in their communities, to guys who nobody likes, doesn't seem to be going anywhere in his life. You might label him a loser, unpopular, not gorgeous, and everything in between. I've worked with guys in a tremendous range of personality styles. In other words, I've worked with abusers who are abrasive, kind of in-your-face, difficult, tense kind of individuals, guys that you might think of as kind of macho, the puff chest kind of macho man style of guy, to guys who were very mild-mannered, soft-spoken. You would never associate him in any way with abusiveness if you weren't involved with him. Much more the sort of chess-playing style of guy than the ice hockey fan kind of style of guy. And again, everything in between. I also happen, by an odd quirk of my family history, to be Spanish-speaking. I actually spoke Spanish before I spoke English. And I led groups in Spanish for abusers for years, and worked with a couple hundred Spanish-speaking abusers over those years. So between my Spanish-speaking groups and my English-speaking groups, I worked with abusers from 20 different countries, and I worked with abusers who were from every possible race and ethnicity within the United States, and abusers who came from lots and lots of money, and abusers who came from no money at all, could barely afford their pack of cigarettes. And certainly, I can say from that experience that each abuser is a unique individual. And if you're involved with an abusive partner, or you're trying to help your sister or your mom or your friend or your colleague who's involved with an abusive partner, this particular guy that you're trying to deal with is going to have his own particular ways that he does things. At the same time, I can tell you from my experience that the similarities among abusive men are much more striking than their differences, from different countries, from different languages that they speak, from different personality styles, from different levels of education. You still notice how much they have in common with other abusive men. And you can start to feel as if they're all graduates of some kind of abuser academy, because they can be so similar in their excuses, in their maneuvers, in their justifications, and in the impact that they have on the abused woman. And so you can think of me as someone who has been spending a lot of time with the other team, because I've been out there counseling abusers for all those years. And think of me as someone who like knows a lot of information about the other team. Like I have the other team's playbook. I know their strategies. I know what they're doing to get away with it. I know how they think. I know how they plan. And now I'm kind of slipping over here to try to slip you all that information, and to make it harder for them to do what they do by equipping you with the information about sort of what their plan is. The abusive man is really, really widely misunderstood in modern society. People have a very inaccurate set of beliefs about why he's doing what he's doing, how he got to be that way, what's going on inside of him, how we might get him to change. And I'm eager to have much more accurate information available to people, much more accurate information available to the women who are dealing with these guys in their personal lives, and to all the loved ones of these women who are trying to figure out how to help. And you know what? I want more accurate information involved to the friends and relatives of the abusive men also, because part of how they're getting away with what they do is by fooling everybody around them into thinking like, this is the greatest guy in the world. And I deal with cases frequently, for example, where a man is being so destructive and his friends and relatives are just insisting that there couldn't be anything wrong. They're continuing to completely blame the woman or call her a liar, when it's obvious that he is doing so much harm. But they just don't want to believe it, and it doesn't fit what they've been told about what an abusive man would be like. So in other words, we're all struggling with all these misconceptions that I want to contribute to having us get out from under. And one of my central messages is that there's a lot of method to the madness. And what I mean by this is that when you look at an abusive man's behavior, it just tends to look kind of wild and berserk, kind of out of control. And it isn't. And the more that you can understand about what he's really up to and where this is all coming from and how the different pieces fit together, the more you start to understand what he's really up to, and the more able you become to free yourself from what's going on for him. So let me give you a little sense of what it is that I'm hoping to do during this program. One is to help you understand what is the profile of the abusive man. How does he behave? What are his sort of key maneuvers, the key areas that his behavior comes out in, what it looks like. And something about where does it come from? Like, how did he learn to be the way he is? Because people have a lot of questions about that. They say, well, Where did he learn that this behavior is okay? Or where did he learn how to do it? How did he learn how to get away with it? I'm going to talk to you quite a bit about some of the myths that there are about abusers, what they're not like. And then I'm going to take you inside of the abuser's thinking to try and understand what's going on inside of his internal world. And one of my key messages, I'm going to give it to you now and I'm going to give it to you again later, is that the abuser's problem at its core is not in his feeling world. His problem actually has very little to do with his emotions. The problem is really almost entirely in how he thinks. It's in his thinking world. And that's why when you try to make an abuser feel better, and you've probably tried various times to make an abuser feel better, his behavior doesn't improve. And you think, well, I did this for him, I did that for him, I did the other thing for him. It made him feel better for a while, and then he's just back to treating me the same way he was treating me before. Like, why didn't it do anything? Well, the reason it didn't do anything is because his heart is not really the issue. There are some issues there, and I'll say a little bit about that, but that's not where the main issue lies. The main issue lies in his attitudes, his values, his beliefs, his ways of thinking, and therefore making him feel better won't change him. The only way he's going to change is to actually make deep, deep changes in his whole outlook, in his whole way of thinking about relationships, about women, about intimacy, about decision-making, about a whole bunch of issues that go on in intimate relationships. Let me say a little bit about what I mean by an abusive relationship or an abusive partner. I mean, this is a huge subject that I'm going to shrink down to a very, very brief comment. But when I'm talking about an abusive partner, I'm talking about a man who is systematically tearing his partner down. He is day in and day out, not every day, but over and over and over again, making her feel bad about herself, taking her freedom away from her, making himself more important and putting himself over her, taking her say over key aspects of her life away from her, very often including, in important ways, taking her say over their sexual relationship away from her, and that's a key issue where abusers do a lot of harm. And generally, in some aspect, even if it's really spread out, sometimes when he gets scary, when he puts her in fear. He may never get his hands on her, may never actually hit her, but he makes her feel like he might. She can just feel this intensity of a kind of a rage that's edged with violence, and so she at least feels that the potential for violence is there, or maybe he does actually attack her at times. So when I'm talking about an abusive partner, I'm talking about a guy who behaves in these ways over and over again, over time. And that the impact on her life is that she is, in fact, over time, being more and more torn down and more controlled. Now, the people that I worked with over my years as a counselor of abusers were men. And the targets of their abuse were women. They were men who abused women. And people will often ask me, well, aren't there women who abuse their female partners, or aren't there men who abuse their male partners, or aren't there even women who abuse their male partners? And the answer to all those things is yes. But it's not my area of expertise. What I can tell you about, both from all those 2,000 cases that I was involved in, and from my familiarity with the research in my field, it's about males who abuse females. What we know about abuse in same-sex relationships is that it's a serious problem. A lot of the dynamics that I'm going to be talking to you about in this webinar, about what goes on when men are abusing women, will actually be very similar to what's going on when women are abusing their female partners, or when a man is abusing his male partner. If you're involved with a same-sex partner who's mistreating you, you're going to recognize a lot of the things that I'm talking about. So a lot of the pieces will fit. And there will probably be pieces that don't really fit. So you'll have to take the pieces that fit you and let the pieces go that don't. The issue of women being abusive towards men has been greatly exaggerated. It does happen, but the notion that it's incredibly common is false. It's not incredibly common. And I have a whole 10-minute thing that I'm not going to put you through about how I know that from the research and from a bunch of other sources. There's a lot of myths on that subject too, to claim that it's much more widespread than it is. It's hard for a woman to put a man in fear, and it's very hard for a woman to get a man to believe that everything she's doing is his fault. And it's really hard to have the key elements of what's really an abusive relationship if you can't do those two things. If you can't put your partner in fear, and if you can't convince your partner that everything you're doing is actually their fault. And that's why we don't see nearly as much of it sort of female towards male. So that's sort of the big picture of what I'm hoping to do over the course of this program. So I said that I would start first talking to you about the profile of the abusive man, what the abusive man is like. And we know a lot about this. 30 years ago, almost 30 years ago when I came into this field, we could have said at that time, oh, abusive men are a little mysterious to us. We don't really know like why they are the way they are. Well, why would he do these things, or how would he learn to be this way? But in our times, it's not a mystery anymore. There have been counseling programs for abusers for 30 years in this country. There's been 30 years of research into abusive men in this country and abroad. They're not a mystery anymore. We actually know what's going on with them. And so step one here is going to be to take you piece by piece through what do we know about what the man who abuses women is like. So, step one, he is a controller. And this is going to be one of the points that I want you to underline in your head and write it in your mind in capital letters and shade it with the yellow highlighting pen. He's a controller. But I'm also going to tell you a couple things right from the beginning to keep in mind about this. One is, he's not a controller with everybody. He's usually just a controller with women he's involved with. So people who work with him, they may not see him as a controller. People that he plays golf with, they may not see him as a controller. His friends and relatives that he grew up with, they may not see him as a controller. But a woman who's involved with him is going to find that he's running her life in a bunch of different ways. And I'll give a few examples now, and then I'll be coming back to talk in more detail about a lot of the different areas that the abusive man controls and how he tends to function in each of those areas. But the key thing for now is he believes that he has the right to control you, to control the woman, and he believes that he has the need to control the woman. So he's going to say, I get to tell you what to do. You have to listen to me. You have to shut up when I tell you to shut up. No, you can't go to town. I told you can't go to town. No, you can't use the car. I haven't given you permission to use the car. That's all about that he has the right to control you. And then the whole business about he has the need to control you, that takes the form of things like saying, if I didn't tell you how to manage the money, this family would fall apart financially. Or if I didn't tell you how to raise those kids, our kids would be a mess because you would just be completely screwing our kids up. So it's not exactly that he has a compulsion to control. I think this is one of the points that people sometimes misunderstand about the abusive man, is they think he's kind of like almost like it's some kind of obsessive or compulsive disorder, like he has this need to control. Except you'll notice on other fronts of his life, he's not really controlling people. So how could this be such a need to control? He believes that you need to be controlled. That's different. That's different from saying that somehow he's just so inwardly driven. And he is going to control various aspects of the woman's life. He may control how she's allowed to argue. Almost all abusers have some ways that they control arguments so that she gets silenced sooner or later. He may control the money. He may control the couple's sexuality, their sexual relationship. He may control her as a parent. He may control her freedom, where she's allowed to go, what she's allowed to wear. He may particularly control her associations, whom she's allowed to speak with, spend time with. But he's not likely to control all those different aspects at once. And there are some abusers who do, who are just like prison guards. Like, he's just watching every move she makes all the time, minutely. But that's actually more the exception than the rule. The more typical abuser is going to control her life in a lot of different ways, but not every way. And there's going to be pieces of what she's allowed to do. And then he's actually going to point to those. If she starts to say that he's abusive, or if other people start to say he's abusive, he's going to point to the things that he's not controlling to prove that he couldn't be abusive. He's like, well, how could I be an abuser? I let her have male friends. I'm obviously not an abuser. One of her best friends is a guy. Or she stays out dancing till 2 in the morning. How could I be an abuser? I wouldn't let her stay out dancing till 2 in the morning if I were an abuser. I just had a case recently where I was doing expert testimony on a court case, a guy who'd been super abusive to his wife, and the father's attorney, the abuser's attorney, was saying to me, well, isn't it true that they once moved to a different house because she was the one that wanted to move to a different house? And I said, yeah, that is true in the history of this couple. And the father's attorney is saying, well, how could he be an abuser? You think an abuser would be willing to give up his house and move to a different house because that's what his wife wanted? And so then I'm in a position of having to explain, yes, that's not at all uncommon that he permits certain things, or that her needs sometimes get attended to, or that sometimes she might win an argument. I think that we have this exaggerated idea of an abuser as someone who's just got the woman completely flattened. And certainly some women are completely flattened and feeling completely flattened. But what's more common is that she does have a voice some days, and she does get to fight back some days, and she even gets her way some days. But it's going 90% his way, or 95% his way, or 98% his way, and she's getting more and more and more hurt over time. The damage is happening so much more to one person than to the other. The reason I emphasize this is because when we have an exaggerated view of what an abuser is, or what an abusive relationship looks like, then that helps an abuser get away with it. Because he can point to some way that he doesn't fit your image of this extreme, caveman, hit her over the head with a rock kind of abuser. And then we think, oh, well, this couldn't really be abusive. And it goes on for the woman, where she may feel like, well, I don't know if what's happening to me is really abuse, because he does let me have friends, or he does let me spend my own money sometimes, or he lets me have a job. And it's like, well, if so many of these things that I'm describing start to fit, then that's an abusive relationship. I want to explain a term that we use a lot in the field of abusive relationships, which is the concept of coercive control. And what we mean by coercive control is that when you stand up to the controller, the control gets even worse. And the way I think of this is that I think of it as a choke collar on a dog. Now, people don't use choke collars on dogs as much as they used to, but some of you will know what I'm talking about. A choke collar is a kind of collar that was designed so that the more the dog resists, the tighter the collar becomes. And so it was a way to get dogs not to pull as hard on the leash, because they would just tighten up the more they pulled. Well, an abuser is like a choke collar. The more you resist him, the tighter his control gets. The more you stand up to his control, the more controlling he becomes. So that's what we mean by coercive control, and we use that term to distinguish coercive control from annoying control, like your cousin or your friend who tells you how to chop the lettuce or tells you when it's time to shift the gears in the car. But the coercive controller gets you back for it if you stand up for yourself, tells you there's something wrong with you if you don't want to be controlled, tells you that you have to be controlled because otherwise you would mess up life so much. That's what coercive control looks like. And When a woman who's involved with an abuser tries to describe to, say, a friend or a relative or a professional the ways that she's being controlled, that person who should be helping her often responds to her as if her partner were an annoying controller, not a coercive controller. And so that's a place where the whole society has to understand the difference. And that when you're involved with a coercive controller, for example, it doesn't do any good to stand up to him more. It also, by the way, doesn't do any good to stand up to him less. We'll come back and talk about that a little later, but the abused woman can't fix it. The problem is in him. She can't fix it by standing up to him more. She can't fix it by standing up to him less. When you're dealing with an annoying controller, like standing up to that person will often help your life. You know, if your brother is going to tell you how to shift the gears in the car and you tell your brother, hey, my car, you don't tell me how to shift the gears in my car, back off. Then they're going to, it's going to help you to some extent. When you're dealing with an abusive partner, that's not going to help you. And so friends, relatives, professionals, anyone who's in this position to help, we need to stop saying things to abused women like, well, why do you let him treat you that way? Or I would never let a guy get away with the stuff that you let him get away with. Well, she's not letting him treat her that way. She has tried many, many times, believe me, to get his behavior to stop. And for those of you who are in a relationship like this, you know what I'm talking about, right? You've tried to stand up to him in all kinds of ways. And what happens? He makes sure that you pay for it. And I hear stories week in and week out from women who are telling me, I told him that I didn't like it when he embarrassed me in front of my friends, so in the future he did even more of embarrassing me in front of my friends. Or I told him, you can't tell me what to wear, so he became even more of a bully about what I wore. Or I told him not to hurt the kids, so he started making the kids feel even worse. And so one key point that I want to get out to people who are in a position of helping an abused woman is to let go of blaming her for how he behaves. She cannot change how he behaves. She can't control how he behaves. It's not her fault. And don't blame her when she does stand up to him, and don't blame her when she doesn't. And by the way, abused women get criticized for both. They get people telling her you need to stand up to him more, and they get people telling her you need to stand up to him less. So what's she supposed to do? You'll have, for example, if she does stand up to him, you'll have friends, relatives, again, professionals saying things to her like, well, you provoke him. You push his buttons. Well, he's gotten violent when you did that, when you said that before, and now you said that again, so you must be looking for him to be violent. If she tries to stand up to him, then people are going to criticize her for that. And the reality is, the abused woman has to make decisions every day of her life. Is this a fight that's worth having with him, or is this not a fight that's worth having with him? Should I take the risk of standing up to him about this subject, even though it's gotten bad before, or should I let it go? And we don't know the right answer as people who are trying to help her. Believe me, we really don't. She's doing the best to figure it out. And the thing is, it changes for her. There are days when she stands up to him and it leads to something good, and there are days when she stands up to him and horrible things happen as a result. So there's no way that we as outsiders can tell her how to navigate these waters. She's figuring it out as best she can, and believe me, she's doing a remarkable job, given the hand that she's been dealt. She's doing really, really well. So the abuser is a highly controlling individual, and his control is coercive in nature. That collar, the more you pull, the tighter it gets. And she's going to do the best she can to figure out how to get more freedom. And there are ways that we can help her figure out how to get more freedom, but not by telling her that she's doing it wrong. That's not going to help her in any way. And there are a lot of effects that come over a person from having lived for years, say, with a partner who's very controlling. It takes a big toll over time. And we'll come back and say more about that later in the program. So the next point that I'd like you to understand about the abusive man, besides how controlling he is how entitled he is. Entitlement, again, one of the central concepts that we use in the field of abusive relationships. What I mean by entitled is that he believes that he's got all kinds of special rights and privileges that don't apply to his partner. This is not about equal exchange. This is about what you can do for me. That's the abuser's attitude. What you can and should do for me. Why is he entitled to these things, in his view? Well, he may have learned it as he was growing up from what his father or stepfather was like, or what his other male relatives were like, his uncles and grandparents. Maybe these were all men who just expected all kinds of service and catering from women. He may have learned it from his peers during his teenage years. We've actually got research evidence showing that abusive guys during their teenage years tend to be hanging with other guys who have very negative ways of talking about females and that are very focused on how they can use females, really, like what I can make you do for me or how I can take advantage of you sexually. They may have learned it from the less healthy aspects of whatever religion they were raised in, and they may have been influenced by pornography. Pornography, unfortunately, is a big influence on abusers and how they learn how to function and how to use women and what kind of demands, rules they have a right to make on women's lives. What entitlement leads to is this attitude of, you owe me, you should be doing more for me, however much you're doing for me, you should be doing even more, however much you've waited on me hand and foot, you should still be waiting hand and foot on me even better. And it leads to a tremendous set of double standards. There's a completely different set of rules for you than there is for him. And it's going to be fine for him to hang out with whoever he wants to hang out with, but he has a right to tell you who you can be with. Including he can flirt with females or even have affairs going with females, but he's going to say you can't be talking to guys or even looking at guys, and you can't dress sexually or however else he may be controlling you about that. He's going to be allowed to yell and scream around the house, but you yell and scream around the house, he's going to call you crazy and say, see, this proves how hysterical you are and how you need to be in a mental hospital. He's going to be allowed to use violence, or at least the threat of violence, intimidation. But if you, again, behave in any of those kinds of ways, he's going to say that just proves what a vicious, violent, out-of-control person you are. He can spend money on the things that he cares about, but you spend any money on things, it just shows how you don't understand money and how you're just wasteful and you don't care about the children and everything's wrong with you. This entitled view, with all these double standards, is part of what that leads to is that he then starts to turn everything into its opposite. So he'll, for example, start to tell you that you're selfish because you sometimes need something for yourself. And he thinks everything should be for him. He'll start to tell you that you're the abusive one. One of the questions that I most commonly get from women is, he says that I'm abusing him. How do I know? Maybe I am. How can I tell? And, of course, the fact that you're even asking that question suggests that it's probably not you. Because the abuser isn't saying, well, my partner says I'm abusive, and am I? The abuser says, my partner says I'm abusive, to hell with her. But these kinds of flips, these kinds of distortions, are what that entitled attitude leads to. It leads to things getting flipped around backwards. And I had a client, for example, who complained to me bitterly, complained to his whole group bitterly, about the fact that his wife tried to kick him between the legs while he was strangling her. And he was outraged in the group. What kind of woman would try to kick a guy there, and now you see how violent she is, and now you see what I'm dealing with, because she attempted to defend herself. I don't know about you, but certainly if somebody were trying to strangle me, and I had a shot to kick them between the legs, believe me, I would not hesitate. But to the abuser, the fact that the woman attempts to defend herself proves all kinds of terrible things about what's wrong with her. So notice that he's actually getting abuse and self-defense exactly backwards. His acts of abusiveness, he's calling self-defense. Like, I was just trying to protect my rights, or I was trying to protect myself from her violence. That's really distorted. It's 180 degrees away from the truth. And then her efforts to protect herself, he's defining as abuse of him. And this isn't just about what happens in physical altercations. This isn't just about what happens when he's being scary. This is about what goes on in their verbal conflicts. He's going to define whatever she's doing to have any kind of voice as wronging him. And he's going to define whatever he does to abuse her as being necessary behaviors to protect his rights. And you can't successfully argue against these distortions. You're not going to be able to get him to recognize how distorted he is, how distorted his thinking is, how much he's switching these things around backwards. So what do we do about it? Well, I'm going to come back to talk about what we do about it. I'm not saying that there's nothing we can do, as nothing that you can do as his partner or as people who care about his partner. There are many things we can do. But one thing we're not going to be able to do is just talk him into seeing it differently. It's too deep in his thinking, and it's too deep in how he has developed his whole system of what works for him. He's a bully. He's a bully, and he's making her constantly do stuff for him, and he likes that. He doesn't want to give that up. He likes being in a relationship where he's able to force the woman to always attend to him. And that's a really serious problem. And we're not going to be able to solve it by just telling him, oh, you need to stop being that way. Part of what this reality flipping thing that abusers do leads to is that he starts to see himself as the victim in the relationship. And again, it's really twisted and distorted, but unfortunately it helps him, because as he moves through the world, he gets a lot of people to feel sorry for him. He tells them about what's going on in his marriage or what's going on with his girlfriend, and people feel really bad for him because they're getting it through this really distorted lens. And a lot of you are dealing with situations where his family is looking at you like there's something wrong with you when you haven't done anything except like happen to be there when he was being horrible to you, have the misfortune of having gotten involved with him. Or your faith community, it may have totally turned on you and is asking like you've done something wrong. And that's a painful part of the experience. So I want you to know you're not alone in that. That's a common part of the experience for many abused women, that people are totally siding with him and are looking at you as if somehow you're bad. And you come out feeling like, what the heck did I do? All I did was be the target of all these horrible ways that he treats me. And so the abuser gets a lot of mileage out of being able to get people to feel sorry for him and get them invested in this really twisted view that he has. So these examples I've given of how the abusive man acts like a victim or even believes it himself leads into my next characteristic of abusers to talk to you about, which is that abusers are manipulative. What I mean by manipulative is that they often make it look like they're doing things for a certain reason when they're actually doing it for a completely different reason. So he, for example, may say that he's doing a certain thing involving money because it's what's going to be good for you or for the family, when actually he's doing it because he wants to control the money, or he wants the money towards something that he's hoping to buy someday, or that he's wanting to control the money so that you can't ever leave him. In other words, he's trying to make it so that you're completely dependent upon him financially. And another example, really common, of how abusers are manipulative is the ways that they pretend to be supportive of your goals, but then keep undermining or sabotaging your goals. So he says, you say you would like to do a certain school program, you'd like to get a certain degree or prepared for a certain job. And he's like, oh, yeah, I think that would be a really great idea. But then he makes it so that there's no money for that, or you never have any time to do your applications. Again, it depends on the style of abusers. Another style of abusers is going to say, no, you're not going to school, not a chance, forget it. But often he's making it look really different. One of the places we see the manipulative skills particularly is how the abuser tends to present himself to children. The children in the home, for example, often think that he's not as bad as he is because he smiles at them and he does favors for them and kind of sweet talks them and stuff to get it to look like he's different. And these manipulative skills make it so that he usually can make himself look pretty good in the community. The abuser usually has a pretty good public image. So people who know him at the store, people who know him at his faith community, people who know him at his job, often think he's quite a nice guy. They often think he's an unusually nice guy. Actually, someone who's particularly generous, who's particularly kind, who's particularly fun. Why? Why would he actually stand out as an extra likable person? Because he's trying to cover up what he's doing at home. And his orientation towards a relationship is he wants power over the woman. He doesn't necessarily even know that, but he's not even necessarily conscious of the fact that he wants power over the woman, but that's what's really going on inside him. A relationship to him isn't about closeness and loving and sharing and intimacy and mutuality and equality, which is what it should be about. A relationship to him is about power. If you're really into having a power relationship with the woman that you're involved with, one of the ways to get that power is to make sure that everybody outside of your relationship thinks you're great. And so abusers actually tend to work harder than non-abusive men to come off really good in other contexts and to get other people to like them. Around the abuser counseling program Emerge in Massachusetts, where I worked for many years, we used to say, I never met an abuser I didn't like. And this is what we were referring to. We were referring to how hard abusers work to make other people feel indebted to them, to make other people feel bad for them, to make other people feel like he's just too nice a guy, it couldn't be him. And part of what that does, unfortunately, is it lays the groundwork so that if the woman finally does get ready to tell the truth, and she finally usually does get ready to start telling people how she's being treated, it's going to be hard for people to believe her because they're going to feel like, oh, it couldn't be him. He's the one that helped me paint my new apartment. It couldn't be him. He helped me look after my kids while I was in the hospital. Oh, no, it couldn't be him. He's actually the head of our annual fund drive for the local food kitchen. Like, there's just no way that this would be an abuser of women. It's like, well, unfortunately, any of those guys could be an abuser of women. So that's actually not at all uncommon, for him to have a really good public image. And that's part of his skills as a manipulator. And how he can get people to do things for him, and it all makes it less work for him. And it makes it harder to identify what he's doing. One thing that I find is a recurring theme in the lives of abused women is that it's not easy to even figure out how to call what he's doing. Like something doesn't feel right, but you don't even know what he just did. And this is part of my mission, is to give you and the people who are trying to help you a language to recognize, well, to call things like, oh, he did this, he did this, he did this, he did this. Once you know what to call things, they already start to lose some of their power to control you and dominate you. The abuser tends to be, unfortunately, a pretty good liar. And he tends to be able to lie with good eye contact. He tends to give a lot of convincing detail. And this is part of how he recruits people in the community to feel bad for him, but it's also part of how he manipulates you, is by lying to you about his intentions, lying to you about his history, lying to you about what he's doing with money. And then once in a while, when he does get caught lying, sort of scrambling to cover it up in some kind of way. So pay attention to signs that your partner is not being truthful to you, and try not to dismiss those, because you're likely to have this thing go on in your head where you think, well, it seems like he's lying about such and such, but that's probably just me. And I'm telling you, no, it's probably not just you. When you get a sense that he's lying, it's probably that he's lying. And try to trust yourself more about what your intuitions are telling you if you get a sense that your partner's not being honest. Because when you have these other behaviors, the controlling behavior and all this demand and double standards and getting scary sometimes, and these different characteristics that kind of make an abuser who he is, well, the lying tends to be part of that pattern. So you got some of these other pieces of that pattern, and then you feel like he's not being honest with you. Trust it. Trust it. Pretty likely that's exactly what's going on. And I don't want to encourage you to live with constant tension and anxiety. That's obviously not going to be good for you. But I also want you to live with your eyes open. I mean, that's one of the challenges of living with an abusive man. And I want you to be safe. I want you to be safe. And so I'm particularly concerned about when he's lying about his involvements with women, because I don't want him doing things that are unsafe to you sexually, that could give you sexually transmitted diseases. And unfortunately, again, I hate to give you an additional set of things to worry about, but abusers are really, really heavily cheaters. They do a lot of cheating. Not every abuser, but I mean, compared to non-abusive men, definitely a lot more likely to be cheaters. And a lot of what goes on with the guys that I've worked with. So next piece, and I think this one's going to really click for pretty much everybody who's been involved with an abusive man, is that the abusive man is disrespectful. So in many ways, we think of respect and abuse as opposites. You don't respect somebody that you abuse. You don't abuse somebody that you respect. And so it's very much woven in to how an abuser functions, that he talks down to the woman, he uses insulting tones of voice, he calls her demeaning and degrading names, he ignores her opinions or just acts like, oh, you don't know what you're talking about, treats her like she's stupid. Fundamentally kind of conditioning her over time to see herself as less than him, to feel beneath him, and to see him as someone who's really smart and really knows a lot about the world and has superior tastes, superior knowledge, superior attitudes. So the abuser sees the woman as less worthy of respect, less competent, less logical, less intelligent, less knowledgeable about the world. And his interest is how he can improve you. You need fixing in his eyes. He wants you to bring you up to his superior level. And the way he's going to do that is by tearing you down and down and down and down. And unfortunately, if you've got children, that means he's also giving a role model to the kids of disrespecting you. Whether he's doing it on purpose or not, his behavior, the example that he's setting, is teaching the kids to disrespect you. And that's going to cause numerous problems. And at its most extreme forms, the abuser really starts to see the woman as a thing. Like if you take disrespect out, greater and greater disrespect, you get to a point of what we call objectification, of where you've really turned the woman into an object. And he sees her as sort of a thing that belongs to him. You may have experiences of feeling over time more and more kind of depersonalized, like your humanity is in some way being erased from the picture. And that's really toxic. That's really toxic to you. And it's important to try to tune into what the impact is on you of being treated as if you're not human, as if you're less than human, as if you're just sort of part of the stuff that belongs to him. That can really, really eat away at you. It's kind of like an acid seeping into your body. It's going to really tend to eat away at you over time. Disrespect is a powerful, powerful force. When we work with abusers in a counseling setting, in an abuser program, that's one of our main themes, is kind of call these guys out on how disrespectful they are towards their partners. I'm going to take a little bit step back in time and talk about, well, what's the abuser like early in a relationship? Well, he's not usually going to look like an abuser. And why? Because no one would go out with him if he looked like an abuser. Women aren't stupid, right? If you go out on your first date with a guy and he takes you to a restaurant and he calls you a fat bitch and he smashes your glass against the wall of the restaurant, you don't ask him like, oh, gee, what are you doing next Saturday? So there has to be a process of entrapment, of him presenting himself as lovable and into you and reasonable. And actually, he really believes that about himself. It's not like he's got a whole plan to abuse you later. This is the whole way his head works. And so he's going to not only be good early in a relationship, unfortunately, he's very often going to be better than a non-abusive man would be early in a relationship. He's going to be extra generous a lot of times, extra attentive, extra charming, extra like, I'm so into you, I'm crazy about you, you're just the most amazing woman I've ever met, extra charming. So we can come back and talk about some of the warning signs, like how do you recognize early who's going to be an abuser? But part of what we have to do as a society is to stop being so influenced by charm. Like, we got to stop thinking that it's just so great that somebody's charming and start asking, like, why are you so charming? Like, getting charming takes a lot of work. Why did you put so much work into becoming charming? Well, sometimes for good reasons, but unfortunately, often people put a lot of work into becoming charming for not such good reasons. So, the message that I want to give to women who are involved with a guy like this is, first of all, he wasn't like this at the beginning. Like, your memory, like, wasn't he different at the beginning? Yes, that's right. He was very different at the beginning. That's why you're involved with him. You were most likely attracted to the best in him. And I can't say that's true for everybody, but for most of you, you were drawn to the best in him. And so to the extent that you can stop blaming yourself, like, oh, why did I, get involved with a guy who was such a jerk? He wasn't such a jerk that you could see in any way. He looked fine early in a relationship. Are there warning signs you can watch out for? Yes. In future relationships, would it be better to avoid certain kinds of characteristics? Absolutely. And we can talk about things to watch out for in the future. But try not to beat yourself up about what happened this time, because he worked hard to create an impression that he was going to do something really different, be something really different. Nothing is ever his fault. So that's another one of the characteristics of an abuser. In his eyes, it's like he's blaming you, he's blaming his childhood, he's blaming that he was drunk, or he's blaming that he hadn't had enough sleep. It's never his fault. So a couple more points that I really want to make sure you understand about what the abusive man is like. One is he tends to make it hard for the woman to have a lot of good, close relationships with other people. The abuser tends to isolate the woman socially. He may make it hard for you to see your friends, hard to see your relatives, not allow you to go to places you used to go to. It may be obvious, like he may just say, no, you can't go there, or no, you can't see that person. A lot of times it's more manipulative, subtler than that. Like every time your sister comes over, he's so crummy to her, behaves like such a jerk, that then your sister just doesn't want to come to the house anymore. Or it may be that every time you go out, without him. He picks a fight with you about something. He says, no, it's fine you went out. I'm fine with you going out. That's great. But you start to notice that it's not really fine with him that you go out because he manages to pick a fight with you about something every time that you do try to go out without him. So we're going to talk more in this program about social isolation and about why the abuser takes all these kinds of steps to isolate the woman and why it's so important to you to notice if you're becoming isolated and to work on steps, and we'll look at some steps you can work on to overcome that isolation, because the isolation's dangerous for you. Getting cut off from the human race is really not good for people. And it can be very hard to figure out what to do about it. I'm not saying it's going to be easy to fight back against his efforts to isolate you, but it's going to be really important to find a way because it's so risky. And then finally, start to notice that he thinks he owns you. His problem isn't that he's too emotional or he's too hurt or he's this or that. His problem is he thinks you belong to him, and you don't. You belong to only you. Your life is yours, not his. So we're approaching the end of part one of the Why Does He Do That webinar. And so I want to do just a little recap of some of the key points of what I've talked about today that I'm eager to see you take away with you. One is the abusive man has a lot of method to his madness. It can look like out of control, wild, random, unplanned, explosive behavior, but actually it's goal-oriented behavior. One of the terms that we use in the abuse field is that the abuser's behavior is instrumental, not irrational. And what we mean by that is what look like random behaviors are actually goal-oriented behaviors. His abuse is an instrument. That's what we mean by instrumental behavior. His abuse is an instrument that he uses to get his way, and it gets him stuff that he wants. And we can look at some of what does the abuser get out of behaving this way. We'll come back to talk about that. That the abuser is a highly controlling individual towards his female partner, but usually not necessarily towards other people in his life, though he may be very controlling towards kids in the home. But other people aren't usually going to see how controlling he is, and that he really believes in his right to be in that kind of control. We talked about how his primary problem isn't actually in his emotional world. It's not really in his heart, in his psychology. It's actually in his values and attitudes, his belief system. And that we're not going to be able to change him by helping him feel better or by resolving his psychological issues or by sending him to therapy. We're going to have to change his values and attitudes. We're going to have to change how he thinks. And that's not an easy project. We will be coming back later to talk about how can that happen and when does it happen. But I'll tell you right now, unfortunately, it doesn't happen often. And then we talked about the split between the public image of the abuser and the private reality of what he's like, and how often everyone else is going to think he's just great while he's being so vicious at home. And then that's part of the experience for the woman and maybe for her children as well. It's just feeling like nobody else gets what I'm living with. Maybe I'm imagining it. And you're not imagining it. He's got this kind of split in him. That's why it's so different. It isn't that you're imagining how he's treating you. And I'm going to be encouraging you, as I already have in part one, throughout this program, to try to listen to your own inner voices, try to trust your sense of what's happening, and try to hold on to your sense of what is real, because the abuser does a lot to try to take away from you your sense of what is real, to try to replace your sense of reality with a very false image about reality that he's trying to impose upon you. In part 2 of the Why Does He Do That webinar, we're going to continue learning a little bit more about this profile of what the abuser is like. We've covered a lot of the main points, but there's just a few more things I'm going to want to get to in part 2. And then we're going to be moving into talking much more about where does this come from? How does the abuser think? What do we do about what he thinks? And looking a bunch more at what are the dynamics that his behavior sets up? How do I know if I'm in an abusive relationship? I'm really glad that you've decided to participate in this program. I hope you're going to find that this information is really useful to you. I hope what we've already done so far gives you a sense that this material is going to help empower you in your own life and in the lives of people that you would like to assist, and really look forward to having your continued participation when we do part 2.